A little after 9 in the morning on the 19th of June, 1944, in the warm waters of the Philippine Sea, an American submarine called the Albacore lined up the single largest target its crew had ever seen. Through the periscope was a Japanese aircraft carrier, brand new, enormous, her deck crowded with aircraft in the middle of taking off into the morning sky. She was the Taiho, the proud flagship of the entire Japanese fleet, the most modern carrier Japan had ever built, armored, powerful, and widely believed to be almost impossible to sink. She was the ship Japan had built for exactly this moment, the decisive battle, and Ozawa had chosen her to fly his flag. She had been in service for barely 3 months by then, so new that her paint was scarcely worn. The Albacore fired a full spread of torpedoes at her from close range and slipped quietly away into the depths before the escorts could react. Almost all of those torpedoes missed. One Japanese pilot, seeing a torpedo running toward the great carrier, deliberately dove his own aircraft into it, giving his life to save the ship. But one torpedo got through, and it struck the Taiho a single blow on her side. In the whole spread the Albacore had fired, in the whole vast target that was a fleet carrier underway, it came down to that one hit. It seemed in the moment like the Japanese had gotten off remarkably lightly, given how large and vulnerable a target a carrier underway presents to a submarine. A ship that size, armored, built to endure taking a single torpedo, should by every reasonable expectation have survived. That one hit would not look dangerous for hours. It would prove, in the end, to be one of the most consequential torpedo strikes of the entire war. And on the deck of the carrier, at first, it hardly seemed to matter. The ship kept moving. She kept launching aircraft. The damage seemed minor, a single hit on a huge and powerful ship built to take punishment. The crew went on with their work, and for several hours the Taiho sailed on as though nothing serious had happened. By the end of that day she was at the bottom of the sea, and her admiral was aboard another ship, and most of the world remembers the Battle of the Philippine Sea for something else entirely. They remember it for what happened in the sky. On that same day, the 19th of June, in the sky above the fleet, American fighters and anti-aircraft guns slaughtered the Japanese naval air arm in a battle so one-sided that the American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were shot down for the loss of a handful of American ones. It was a crushing, historic victory, and it deserves its fame, and we will give it its due. But here is the thing that the fame of the Turkey Shoot has almost buried. Japan did not just lose aircraft that day. Japan lost 3 aircraft carriers. And not one of those 3 carriers was sunk in the great air battle everyone remembers. This is the story of how Japan truly lost 3 of its carriers at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Not the air battle, which has been told 1,000 times, but the naval battle hidden beneath it, the one fought by submarines and torpedoes, and one desperate decision made in the dark. This is how the ships died. To understand the naval battle, you have to understand what was at stake, and why Japan sent its entire fleet to fight it. In the middle of June 1944, American forces landed on the island of Saipan in the Mariana Islands. This was not just another island in the long Pacific campaign. The Marianas were close enough to Japan that, once the Americans held them and built airfields there, their big bombers, the new B-29 superfortresses, would be able to reach the Japanese home islands themselves. For the whole war so far, the Japanese homeland had been beyond the reach of sustained American bombing. The Marianas would change that. From Saipan and its neighboring islands, the bombers could strike Japan's cities and factories directly, night after night. Losing the Marianas meant, in effect, opening the home islands to attack. The loss of the Marianas would bring the war directly to Japan's doorstep. The Japanese High Command understood exactly what this meant, and they decided to stake everything on stopping it. This was not going to be a delaying action or a raid. This was to be the decisive battle, the one great fleet action that Japanese naval doctrine had dreamed of for decades, in which the enemy fleet would be met and destroyed in a single climactic engagement. Japan had been waiting, in a sense, its whole modern naval history for this kind of battle. Now, with the home islands themselves at stake, the moment had come. The commander of the combined fleet, Admiral Toyoda, put it in the starkest possible terms when he sent his fleet into action. The fate of the empire, he signalled, rested on this one battle. It was not rhetoric. He meant it exactly, because he understood what the loss of the Marianas would open up. So Japan sent its fleet, the whole rebuilt striking force it had spent a year assembling, under the command of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. This was not a scratch force. After the losses of the previous 2 years, the Japanese Navy had spent a year carefully rebuilding its carrier air groups, training new pilots, gathering its ships for exactly this kind of decisive battle. Ozawa's mobile fleet was the product of that year of preparation, the best Japan could still put to sea, and it was being committed all at once, everything staked on a single throw. 9 carriers, with battleships and cruisers around them, sailed to give battle to the American fleet covering the Saipan landings. Ozawa had a plan, and it was a clever one on paper. His aircraft could fly farther than the American aircraft could, so he intended to launch his strikes from far out at sea, beyond the range at which the Americans could hit him back. His planes would attack the American carriers and then fly on to land at airfields on Guam, refuel, and strike again on the way back. He would hit the Americans from a distance they could not answer. It did not work, and the reason it did not work is the part of the story that everyone knows. When Ozawa launched his carefully planned strikes on the 19th of June, they flew straight into the most effective air defense the world had yet seen. The American carriers had radar that saw the Japanese formations coming from far out, long before they arrived, giving the defenders time to climb and position themselves. They had a system for directing their fighters using that radar that put the defending planes in exactly the right place at exactly the right height to meet each incoming raid. This was the invisible machinery of the victory, the ability not just to see the enemy coming, but to guide the defenders to the perfect intercept, again and again, all day long. They had a superb fighter, the Hellcat, flown by well-trained pilots, and they had new anti-aircraft shells that exploded near their targets without needing a direct hit. Every one of those advantages fed into the others. The radar found the enemy far out. The fighter direction sent the Hellcats to meet them. The Hellcats, flown by men with far more training than their opponents, cut through the Japanese formations, and whatever got past the fighters ran into a wall of anti-aircraft fire more accurate than anything seen before in the war. It was not a fair fight, and it was never meant to be. And the Japanese pilots, by this stage of the war, were mostly young and poorly trained, the veterans having long since been killed in earlier battles. The result was not a battle so much as a massacre. Ozawa sent his strikes in one after another through the day, and one after another they were torn to pieces. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft was detected while still far out, intercepted by waiting fighters and shot down, most of them before they could even reach the American ships. The Japanese pilots were brave, and they pressed their attacks. But bravery was no answer to the wall of radar-directed fighters and shell fire they flew into. By the end of the day, the Japanese had lost hundreds of aircraft, and the Americans only a handful. The American pilots, watching enemy planes fall out of the sky in such numbers, gave the day its famous name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It destroyed the Japanese naval air arm as an effective fighting force in a single day, and it earned every bit of its place in history. No account of the Philippine Sea would be honest without giving it that place. But it is not the whole battle, and it is not even the part of the battle that sank the ships. But the Turkey Shoot was the air battle. And while it raged in the sky, a very different battle was being fought below, on and under the surface of the sea, and it was that naval battle that actually sent Japan's carriers to the bottom. This is the hinge of the whole story. The turn from the famous slaughter in the sky to the quiet, deadly work being done beneath it. The instrument of the naval disaster was not a battleship or a carrier. It was the submarine, and specifically two American submarines that had worked their way into position near Ozawa's fleet, the Albacore and the Cavalla. Submarines were the hidden dimension of the war at sea, and they may have been the most decisive weapon the United States possessed in the whole Pacific. While the carriers and battleships fought their famous battles on the surface, American submarines waged a quieter, relentless campaign beneath the waves, sinking the tankers and freighters that carried Japan's oil and steel and food, slowly starving the island empire of everything it needed to fight. By 1944, the American submarine campaign had become a stranglehold on Japan's throat, tightening month by month. And the same submarines that hunted the tankers and freighters were just as deadly to warships as to merchantmen when the opportunity came. At the Philippine Sea, the opportunity came in the form of the richest collection of targets imaginable, an entire enemy carrier fleet maneuvering in waters where the submarines lay waiting. A carrier could strike at enormous range with its aircraft, but it could not see beneath the waves, and there, silent and patient, the submarines waited. Throughout the Pacific War, American submarines quietly strangled Japan, sinking its merchant ships and its warships alike. Japan was an island nation that depended completely on the sea for everything: its oil, its raw materials, its food, and the American submarine force cut those lifelines one ship at a time, until the Japanese economy itself began to collapse. They were never more deadly than when they found themselves squarely in the path of a fleet. On the 19th of June, as Ozawa maneuvered his carriers to launch the airstrikes that were being massacred overhead, two American submarine captains in two separate boats found themselves looking through their periscopes at the most valuable targets in the entire Japanese Navy. Ozawa's own maneuvering, turning his fleet into the wind to launch and recover aircraft, brought his carriers across the paths of the waiting submarines. The very act of fighting the air battle, of turning to launch and land the planes that were being massacred overhead, put the great ships squarely in front of the waiting torpedoes. There is a grim irony in that. The air battle that Japan was losing so badly in the sky was also, at the same time, steering its finest carriers into the crosshairs of the submarines below. The first to strike was the Albacore, and her target was the greatest prize of all, Ozawa's flagship, the brand new armored carrier Taihō. The Taihō was the pride of the Japanese fleet, and Ozawa had chosen her as his flagship, precisely because she was the newest and the best. From her bridge he commanded the whole operation, the 9 carriers, the battleships. The entire fortune of the Japanese Navy gathered for the decisive battle. She was meant to be the ship that carried Japan into the next phase of the carrier war. Tougher and more survivable than anything that had come before. She had an armored flight deck, unusual for a Japanese carrier, designed to let her shrug off the bomb hits that would cripple lighter ships. The Japanese had studied the war closely, and they had built the Taihō specifically to survive the kind of dive bomber attack that had destroyed 4 of their carriers at Midway 2 years before. Midway had taught them, in the hardest possible way, how vulnerable a carrier's wooden flight deck was to bombs, and the Taiho was their answer. On paper, she was the answer to Japan's greatest vulnerability, a carrier that could take a beating from the air and keep fighting. What her designers had armoured her against was bombs falling from above. They had not, and could not, armour her against the danger that actually killed her, which came from below the waterline and from within her own hull. She was big, fast, modern, and thought to be exceptionally tough, the ship that carried Japan's hopes for the future of carrier warfare. And on the morning of the 19th, she had been in commission for a little over 3 months. When the Albacore fired her spread of torpedoes, the Taiho's own aircraft were in the middle of taking off. One Japanese pilot, airborne just as the torpedoes began their run toward the carrier, saw the danger to his flagship and made an instant and terrible choice, in the space of a heartbeat, with no time to weigh it. He deliberately flew his aircraft into the path of one of the torpedoes, detonating it, sacrificing himself to protect the ship. It was an act of extraordinary devotion, a man giving his life without hesitation to try to save his ship and his admiral. And it very nearly worked, because most of the other torpedoes missed as well, running wide or deep past the great carrier. But one did not. One torpedo struck the Taiho on her starboard side, and that single hit on that huge armoured ship would prove to be enough. At first it did not look like enough. The Taiho was enormous and well built, and that one hit, while serious, was the kind of damage a ship like that was designed to survive. She stayed in formation. She continued flight operations. The hit had jammed one of her forward aircraft elevators and cracked open some of her aviation fuel lines. But there was no great fire, and no immediate crisis anyone could see. To the men aboard, and to Ozawa on her bridge, the Taiho seemed wounded but entirely alive, a great ship that had absorbed a blow and shrugged it off. There was no reason yet for alarm, and every reason for confidence. The Admiral went on directing the great battle from her bridge, confident in the powerful modern ship beneath his feet, with no idea that she was already, silently, filling with the vapour that would kill her. The real danger was invisible, and it was growing quietly in the sealed spaces below the deck, where gasoline vapour from the cracked fuel lines was slowly, steadily filling the ship with an explosive mist that no one on the bridge could see or smell. Hour by hour, as the Taiho fought on, the trap inside her was being armed. And here the disaster became a Japanese one in the truest sense, because what happened next was not done by the enemy. It was done by the Taiho's own crew through inexperience. This is the heart of why the Taiho matters so much to this story. She was not overwhelmed by superior force. She was not battered by wave after wave of attackers. She took one torpedo, a wound she was built to survive, and then she was killed by the mistakes of a green crew that had never learned, the hard way, how to fight to save a stricken ship. An officer, trying to clear the dangerous gasoline fumes building up inside the ship, ordered the ventilation system run at full power to blow the vapour away. The thinking behind it was understandable. There were dangerous fumes accumulating, and the instinct was to get rid of them, to move the air, to clear the ship. To a crew that had not learned the hard lessons of damage control through bitter experience, running the ventilation seemed like the obvious answer, common sense even. But damage control on a warship is a discipline, full of hard-won and counterintuitive rules, and one of them is that you do not blow the fumes from a fuel leak through the rest of the ship. The Americans knew this, having learned it in blood. This Japanese crew on a brand new ship did not. It was a reasonable-sounding idea, and it was exactly the wrong thing to do. Instead of clearing the fumes, The ventilation system spread them. It pushed the explosive vapor out of the damaged spaces and drove it all through the interior of the carrier, into compartment after compartment, corridor after corridor, until much of the ship was filled with an invisible, volatile cloud waiting for a spark. What had been a dangerous but contained problem in a few damaged spaces became a ship-wide bomb. The very effort to make the Taiho safe had turned her into a floating explosion waiting to happen. The spark came in the early afternoon, hours after the single torpedo had struck, when the Taiho seemed to have weathered the blow. Somewhere in the vapor-filled interior of the great carrier, something ignited, a spark from machinery, an electrical fault. No one will ever know exactly what, and the entire ship erupted. The explosion was catastrophic, tremendous blasts tearing through the carrier from within, blowing out sections of her hull and her flight deck, turning the pride of the Japanese fleet into a dying wreck in an instant. The armoured carrier that was supposed to be nearly unsinkable, the flagship that carried Japan's hopes, was destroyed not by the enemy's bombs, but by her own fuel and her own crew's fatal mistake. Hours after a single hit that should never have been fatal at all. It was a death out of nightmare. The mightiest ship in the fleet blown open from the inside by the very vapours her crew had tried to clear. Ozawa was forced to abandon her and transfer his flag to another ship, and the Taiho went down, having been at war for barely 3 months. That was the first carrier. The second died within hours of the first, and it too fell to a submarine. While the Albacore had been stalking the Taiho, another American submarine, the Cavalla, had worked her way into firing position against a second Japanese carrier. This one was no untested newcomer. She was the Shokaku, one of the most famous carriers in the Japanese Navy, a veteran of the great battles of the war. She had fought almost everywhere the Japanese carriers had fought, from Pearl Harbor onward through the great carrier battles of the war. She had taken heavy damage before, and survived it more than once. A tough and famously lucky ship with a long fighting record and a veteran crew. If any Japanese carrier seemed likely to survive the war, it was the Shokaku. Where the Taiho was the untested future of the fleet, the Shokaku was its battle-hardened past. And on this one afternoon, in these same waters, both the future and the past of the Japanese carrier navy would go down within hours of each other, both of them killed not by the famous air battle but by American submarines, and she carried a particular distinction that gave her sinking a terrible symmetry. The Shokaku had been at Pearl Harbor. She was one of the 6 carriers that had launched the surprise attack that began the war, one of the ships whose aircraft had rained bombs and torpedoes on the American battle line on that Sunday morning. Her aircraft had been among those that struck the American fleet on the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, the day the war began. Now, 2.5 years later, in the same wide Pacific, the reckoning had come for her at last, and it came from beneath the waves. The Cavalla put 3 or 4 torpedoes into the Shokaku, and unlike the single hit on the armoured Taiho, these were mortal wounds from the start. The torpedoes tore into her, and fires broke out, and this time there was no ambiguity about how serious it was. The Shokaku was hit hard and hit well, and she began to burn and to flood in a way that no damage control could master. Where the Taiho's death was slow and strange, the Shokaku's was more direct, the straightforward destruction of a ship by a well-placed spread of torpedoes. The veteran carrier was torn open, set ablaze, and began to die. It took some time, but there was no saving her. Fires spread, water poured in, and slowly the great carrier lost her fight. In the late afternoon, the Shokaku, which had helped begin the war at Pearl Harbor 2.5 years earlier, rolled over and sank beneath the Philippine Sea, taking a great many of her crew with her. The Cavalla paid a price for her attack. The Japanese escorts came after the submarine mercilessly, and over the hours that followed, they dropped more than 100 depth charges around her, trying to destroy the boat that had killed the famous carrier. For the crew of the Cavalla, it was a terrifying ordeal, trapped beneath the sea while the explosions hammered the hull, each blast close enough to spring leaks, shatter fittings, and knock men off their feet. There is no fighting back for a submarine under depth charge attack. There is only silence and endurance, and the hope that the hull will hold and the enemy will eventually give up and go away. But the submarine was tough and well handled, and she rode out the storm of depth charges and slipped away into the deep. But the Cavalla survived the ordeal, and the Shokaku did not. That is where the first half of the story ends, with 2 Japanese carriers gone in a single afternoon, both to submarines, while the air battle that would take all the fame still raged overhead. It took 8 hours to get every name and number in this story right, because the naval side of the Philippine Sea has been almost completely overshadowed by the air battle above it. If this is the history you want more of, hit like. 1 like. Nothing more? Thank you. Hit subscribe right now, because coming up is the 3rd carrier, the controversial decision that let the Japanese fleet escape. The American strike launched at the very edge of possibility, and the desperate gamble in the dark that saved hundreds of pilots and could have cost an entire fleet. Do not go anywhere. By the end of the 19th of June, the day of the Turkey Shoot, Japan had lost 2 of its carriers to submarines and most of its naval aircraft to the guns and fighters of the American fleet. It had been a catastrophe. But the American commanders did not yet fully know the scale of what they had won. And on the night of the 19th, a decision was made that has been argued over ever since. The overall American commander was Admiral Raymond Spruance, a careful and deliberate officer, the same man who had commanded at Midway 2 years earlier and won the most important naval victory of the war. Spruance was not a flashy admiral. He did not gamble. He weighed his responsibilities coldly and acted on them. And at the Philippine Sea, his first responsibility, as he understood it, was not to destroy the Japanese fleet at all costs, but to protect the invasion of Saipan that the whole operation existed to support in the first place. The battle was being fought to take the Marianas, not merely to sink ships, and Spruance never lost sight of that. His carriers, under the tactical command of Admiral Mark Mitcher, wanted to charge west through the night, chase down Ozawa's fleet, and finish it off. But Spruance held them back. Against the instincts of his own carrier admirals, who could feel the enemy within reach and wanted to lunge after him, Spruance refused. His first duty, as he saw it, was to protect the American invasion of Saipan. Tens of thousands of American soldiers and Marines were ashore on that island, or waiting in transports off its beaches. And if the Japanese fleet got past him in the dark and fell upon those transports, the slaughter would be catastrophic. Spruance feared exactly that, a Japanese end run around his carriers in the night, a feint to draw him west, while the real blow fell on the invasion. He had no way to be certain it was not coming, and the cost of being wrong was too high to risk. So rather than race after the enemy, he kept his carriers near Saipan through the night, guarding the landings. It was a cautious decision, and it has been debated by naval officers and historians ever since, one of the great what-ifs of the Pacific War. The argument has never really been settled because both sides of it are strong. What is certain is that Spruance made his choice for a clear and defensible reason, the safety of the invasion, and that the choice shaped everything that followed on the 20th. By holding back to protect the invasion, Spruance gave Ozawa's battered fleet a head start. a chance to escape to the west during the night. Through those dark hours, while the Americans guarded Saipan, the Japanese fleet steamed away as fast as its damaged ships could manage, putting precious miles of ocean between itself and its pursuers. Every hour that passed was an hour the Japanese used to run, and by dawn they were far away. Some have argued he was too cautious, that he let a beaten enemy get away when he might have destroyed it completely, and that a bolder admiral would have won an even greater victory. Others have defended him, pointing out that his primary job was to protect the landings, that he could not have known the Japanese fleet was as crippled as it was, and that he did exactly what he had been sent there to do. Either way, the effect was that when morning came on the 20th, the Japanese fleet was far to the west, running for safety, and the Americans had to chase. All through the 20th of June, the American carriers steamed west, launching scouts to find the fleeing enemy. It was a frustrating, tense day. Everyone aboard knew that a great victory had been won the day before, and that a beaten enemy fleet was somewhere ahead of them, running for home. But knowing it was out there and finding it in the vastness of the ocean were two very different things. The scouts flew out and came back empty, again and again, and the hours slipped away, and for most of the day they found nothing. The Japanese had a long head start, and the ocean is vast, and hour after hour went by with no contact. It began to look as though Ozawa would escape entirely, carrying the survivors of his fleet home to fight another day. For the American commanders, it was an agonizing prospect to have won so crushing a victory in the air, and then to let the enemy fleet slip away untouched by their own carriers. The day was running out, and with it the chance to finish what the submarines had begun. And then, late in the afternoon, almost at the end of the day, an American scout finally found them. The Japanese fleet was located at last, but it was located at an enormous distance, far to the west, near the very limit of how far the American aircraft could fly, and still hope to return. The news that the enemy had been found came wrapped in a hard problem, because finding them so late and so far away meant that any attack would be a race against the fuel gauges and the setting sun. This put Admiral Mitcher in the position that would define the battle and reveal the character of the man. Mitcher was an aviator to his bones, a man who had spent his life around carriers and the men who flew from them, and he felt the weight of every decision about his airmen personally. Now he faced a choice that pitted the chance to hurt the enemy against the near certain loss of some of his own young pilots, and he had only minutes to make it. It was late in the day, the light already beginning to fade. The enemy was at extreme range, so far away that a strike launched against them would have to fly out near the very limit of its fuel, attack, and then make the long flight back in darkness, with many aircraft certain to run out of fuel before they reached home. To launch was to risk losing much of his air strength, not to the enemy, but to the sea and the night. To hold back was to let the enemy escape. Mitcher weighed it, the range against the risk, the prize against the cost, in the few minutes he had to decide. And he chose to strike. He would not let them slip away into the night unpunished. This was the aggressive instinct that Spruance's caution had held in check the night before. And now, given his chance, Mitcher took it without hesitation. He knew what it would cost. He knew that launching this late, at this range, meant sending his men on a mission from which many would not return, not because the enemy would kill them, but because the fuel would simply run out on the way home. He accepted that cost, because the prize was the Japanese fleet, and he was not willing to let it escape untouched. He ordered the launch. More than 200 aircraft took off in the late afternoon and flew west into the setting sun, toward a target at the very edge of their range. It was a mass of dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters. The striking power of a great carrier fleet, launched on a mission that everyone who watched them go understood was a gamble. The men in those cockpits knew it too. They had done the arithmetic of fuel and distance themselves. They flew west anyway, into the dying light, because that was the job, and because the enemy fleet was out there and this was the only chance to catch it. They found Ozawa's fleet as the light was failing, at the very end of the day, with the sun going down and the long night ahead of them. The pilots had flown out near the limit of their fuel just to reach the enemy, and now they had to fight and then somehow get home. There was no time for a careful, coordinated attack. They struck fast in the fading light, hitting the Japanese ships as best they could in the short time their fuel allowed before they had to turn for home. And in the attack that followed, the American aircraft sank the third carrier of the battle, the Hiyo, sending her to the bottom to join the Taiho and the Shokaku. They damaged other ships as well, battleships and cruisers, and 2 oilers so badly hit they had to be scuttled. In the space of that brief, furious attack at the end of the day, the Americans added the third and final carrier to the tally, and battered what was left of Ozawa's fleet. But unlike the submarines the day before, the aircraft had struck at the very limit of their reach, and that limit was about to exact a terrible price on the way home. 3 carriers now were gone, the Taiho and the Shokaku the day before, and the Hiyo at dusk. But the American aircraft had done their work in the last of the daylight, far from home, and now they had to get back, and the sun was going down over an ocean that offered them nowhere to land. What followed was one of the most harrowing episodes in the history of carrier warfare, and one of the most humane decisions any admiral made in the entire war. The American aircraft turned back east in the darkness, more than 200 of them, and they were running out of fuel. Many had been damaged. The pilots were exhausted, flying in the dark over open ocean, trying to find their way back to a fleet of ships that were themselves nearly invisible in the night. Aircraft began to run dry and fall into the sea. One by one, engines coughed and died as the last of the fuel was used up, and planes dropped out of the darkness into the black water below. Inside those aircraft were young men who had done everything asked of them, who had flown to the edge of the world and struck the enemy and were now trying only to get home, and who were running out of the fuel that was their only way back. Some ditched under control and scrambled into life rafts. Others simply vanished into the sea. And still the fleet ahead of them lay dark, as the rules of war demanded, invisible in the night. And the carriers they were trying to reach were, by every rule of war, supposed to stay dark, because a lit-up ship at night was a perfect target for any submarine that might be lurking nearby. Mitcher made his decision, and it was the opposite of caution. He ordered the ships of the fleet to turn on their lights, every light they had. Searchlights pointed straight up into the sky like beacons. Deck lights, signal lights, running lights. Star shells fired overhead to burst in the darkness, the whole fleet suddenly blazing in the night like a floating city, so that his lost and fuel-starved pilots could see it from far off and find their way home. Men who were there described it as one of the most extraordinary sights of the war, an entire task force that had spent years learning to hide in the dark, suddenly lighting itself up on purpose in the middle of enemy waters. It was a direct violation of the most basic rule of night operations in submarine-infested waters. Mitcher was deliberately lighting up his entire fleet, every carrier and every escort, making them visible for miles to any enemy submarine that might be waiting in the darkness. He did it with his eyes open. He understood that he might be trading the lives of thousands of sailors and the loss of irreplaceable carriers for the lives of a few hundred airmen. But he could not bring himself to sit in the safe dark and listened to his own men go into the water for want of a light to steer by. He chose his airmen, and he accepted the risk to everyone else, and he lit the fleet. The gamble worked, and it saved a great many lives, though the cost of that day was still heavy. The lights did exactly what Mitchell had hoped they would do, and no enemy submarine, as it happened, was in position to make him pay for the risk. Pilots who had been lost in the dark, down to their last gallons of fuel, saw the glow of the fleet on the horizon and steered for it. Some made it to a deck. Others, out of fuel at last, ditched close enough to the lit-up ships to be found and pulled from the water. The blaze of light that could have drawn a submarine's torpedoes instead became a lighthouse that guided hundreds of men home. Of the more than 200 aircraft that had made the strike, only a fraction managed to land safely back aboard a carrier, and often not the carrier they had started from, coming down on whatever deck they could find. Around 80 aircraft were lost, either ditching in the sea when their fuel ran out, or crashing as they tried to land in the dark. But because Mitchell had lit the fleet, and because a huge rescue effort combed the sea in the following hours and days, the great majority of the men were saved. Of all the air crew who went into the water that night, only a small number were lost. Rescue ships and destroyers spent the following hours and days combing the sea, pulling exhausted, oil-soaked men from their rafts and from the open water. It was an enormous effort, and it worked. The overwhelming majority of the men who had flown that desperate mission and gone into the sea on the way home when their fuel gave out were plucked out of the water alive and returned to their ships in the days that followed. It was, in the end, a rescue as remarkable as the strike itself. The aircraft could be replaced easily by American factories that were turning out planes by the tens of thousands. The men could not be replaced at all, and thanks to the lights, most of them did not have to be. They came home. That was the trade Mitchell had made, aircraft for men, and it was the right one. Here is how the three carriers died, in order, stripped of the fame of the air battle. On the 19th of June, late morning, the submarine Albacore put a single torpedo into the armoured flagship Taihō, damage that should have been survivable. On the 19th of June afternoon, the submarine Cavalla sank the veteran carrier Shokaku, a survivor of Pearl Harbor, with a spread of torpedoes. Also on the 19th afternoon, the Taiho, her gasoline vapors spread through the ship by her own crew's mistake, exploded from within and sank. A single torpedo turned fatal by inexperience. On the 20th of June, at dusk, aircraft from Mitchell's carriers, striking at extreme range, sank the third carrier, the Hiyo, before making their desperate flight home in the dark. When it was over, and the surviving ships had limped home, the full scale of the naval disaster became clear. Japan had lost 3 aircraft carriers, the brand-new Taiho, the veteran Shokaku, and the Hiyo, along with hundreds of aircraft and, most cripplingly of all, hundreds of trained pilots and aircrew that it simply could not replace in any useful time. 3 more carriers were damaged. But the deepest wound was not the ships or even the aircraft. It was the men. The hundreds of trained pilots and aircrew lost in those 2 days were the product of that year of careful rebuilding, and they could not be replaced in any reasonable time. The carefully rebuilt Japanese carrier force, the one Toyota had staked the fate of the empire upon, had been shattered as an offensive weapon, and it would never recover. From this point on, Japan had carriers but almost no trained pilots to fly from them. Hulls without their air groups, a fleet that had lost the one thing that made it dangerous. When the Japanese carriers next went into battle, a few months later at Leyte Gulf, they would be used not as a striking force at all, but as bait, deliberately sacrificed to lure the American fleet away, empty of any real air power. The pilots to fill their decks no longer existed. The Philippine Sea had killed them, and a carrier without its aircrew is only a large and vulnerable ship. The factors behind the loss of those three carriers are worth naming plainly, because they were naval factors, not the aerial ones the battle is famous for. The first factor was the American submarine. Two submarines, the Albacore and the Cavalla, sank two of Japan's three lost carriers, including its brand new flagship, without a single aircraft involved in their destruction. For all the vast air battle overhead, it was these two small, unseen boats that struck the heaviest blows against the ships themselves. The submarine was the quiet, unglamorous partner of American sea power, overshadowed in memory by the carriers and their aircraft, and at the Philippine Sea it did what all the aircraft of the famous Turkey Shoot could not. For all the hundreds of Japanese planes shot down on the 19th, the air battle did not sink a single one of Japan's carriers. It destroyed their aircraft and their aircrew, which mattered enormously and shaped the rest of the war. But the ships themselves, the carriers, were untouched by the great slaughter in the sky. It was the submarines, unseen beneath the waves, that sent the carriers to the bottom. The second factor was Japanese damage control, or the lack of it. The Taiho was lost not to the torpedo that hit her, but to the catastrophic mistake her own crew made in trying to deal with it. A better trained crew, with the hard-won damage control doctrine the Americans had developed, would very likely have saved the ship. The Americans had learned through their own painful losses earlier in the war exactly how to fight fires and contain fuel and keep a wounded carrier alive, and they had turned damage control into something close to a science. The Japanese had not, and the Taiho paid the price. The loss of the flagship was, in the end, very largely self-inflicted. The third factor was the decision to strike at extreme range on the 20th, which sank the Hiyo. Mitchell chose to accept heavy operational losses, aircraft ditching in the dark, rather than let the enemy escape untouched. He judged the third carrier and the damage to Ozawa's fleet worth the aircraft it would cost him, and the price of that third carrier was paid in planes lost to the sea and the darkness rather than to the enemy's guns. The fourth factor, stated and set beside the rest, was the courage of a command decision made in the dark, the choice to light the fleet. It did not sink any ships itself, but it saved the men who had sunk the enemies, and it stands as one of the finest decisions of moral courage in the whole naval war. An admiral who was willing to hazard his entire fleet and his own career and reputation rather than abandon his airmen to the sea, showed the kind of leadership that men remember for the rest of their lives and follow anywhere. The pilots who came home that night, guided by those lights, never forgot who had turned them on and what it had risked to do it. It is the human counterweight to the Japanese disaster on the other side of the battle, where a green crew's honest mistake doomed their own unsinkable flagship. Two navies, two ways of handling a crisis, and the difference between them written in ships saved and ships lost. Strip away the famous air battle in the sky, and the naval story of the Philippine Sea comes down to a single reversal worth stating plainly. Japan did not lose its three carriers in a glorious clash of flight decks. It lost two of them to submarines it never saw, one of those because its own crew spread the gasoline vapor that blew the ship apart. It lost the third the next day to aircraft that flew to the very edge of their endurance to catch a fleet already in retreat. The battle everyone remembers happened in the sky, and it was spectacular, and it destroyed Japan's naval airmen. But the battle that actually sank the ships happened in the water, beneath the surface and out at the edge of darkness, and it was quieter and stranger, and in its own way more decisive. The aircraft can be rebuilt. Sunken carriers cannot be raised, and drowned crews cannot be recalled. That is the honest measure of what actually sank Japan's ships at the Philippine Sea. The Turkey Shoot destroyed Japan's naval aircraft, and it earned its fame, and nothing here takes that away. But the aircraft were only part of the loss. The carriers themselves, the great ships that were the whole point of a carrier fleet, were killed by torpedoes from unseen submarines, by a crew's fatal error, and by a long-range strike at dusk. It is that naval battle, hidden beneath the famous air battle, that truly broke the Japanese fleet. The Shokaku, which had launched her own aircraft against Pearl Harbor on the first morning of the war, lies now at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, sunk by a submarine on a single afternoon, 30 months on from that first morning. The Taiho, the unsinkable flagship, the pride of the Japanese Navy, lies near her, destroyed on her very first time in battle by a single torpedo and a fatal mistake, after barely 3 months of life. And out to the east, scattered across the ocean floor, lie the aircraft that ditched in the dark on the night of the 20th, their engines starved of fuel. Their pilots were mostly pulled from the water alive in the hours that followed, because an American admiral chose to light up his entire fleet rather than let them drown for want of a lamp to steer by. That is the naval battle of the Philippine Sea, the one beneath the one everyone remembers. The Turkey Shoot won the headlines and the famous name, and it deserved them. But it was the torpedoes from the unseen submarines, and the fatal errors of a green crew, and the strike launched at the edge of darkness, that actually sank the ships. And sinking the ships, not the aircraft alone, is what broke the back of the Japanese carrier fleet for good, and cleared the way for everything that came after in the Pacific. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because every week we tell you how the war at sea was actually fought and won, the famous battles and the hidden ones beneath them, told straight, without the myths and without the easy legends. Hit subscribe and then like this video, so that it reaches more of the people who should know the real truth of how Japan lost those 3 carriers at the Philippine Sea, in the naval battle hidden beneath the famous one in the sky. And tell us down in the comments where in the world you are watching from right now. And we will see you again in the very next one.